Hey everyone, Chris Sawyer here. Welcome back to the Varietal Show. I'm right now, I've got the Lingua Franca bottle of Chardonnay. So lovely. This is the Sisters. And this is the great, amazing man himself, Larry Stone, Master Sommelier, masterful person to be around, and a good acquaintance of mine for many, many years. Larry and I met way back in the, back in the 90s when I started at Wine X magazine. But we had a great time when he was down in Napa Valley. We went to, he was working with Quintessa Winery, and that tasting that we did was pretty good out that hut. And
we call them pavilions.
Pavilions, but they were pretty good, and doing that retrospective with you. But the fact is, you came up here to Oregon, of all places. This man came to Oregon to fulfill part of his dream, and that is to make amazing world-class Chardonnay and Pinot Noir. And Larry, I'm so glad to be here with you at the winery and to talk a little bit about this and what brought you up here in the first place, but also what you're doing now, some of the lessons you've learned about making these amazing wines and putting together the staff that really does it, and why you built it for success. So tell everyone a little bit about yourself. We know the great Master Sommelier story. We could go into that forever. But Rubicon and these places that you worked at, you had a passion for Burgundy.
Well, I loved, I'm very eclectic. I love all sorts of wines. I grew up in Seattle. So in Seattle,
that's that way.
Yeah, a little north of here, about a 4-hour drive from here, 3 hours from Portland. And I'll be going up there in a couple of weeks again. But the fact is that I grew up with mainly California wines. Basically in my family, California and German, because my mother loved Riesling, so we drank a lot of Riesling. And my mother also liked Loire Valley wines. We had a lot of Vouvray, different, nothing. We were not wealthy, so we didn't have like some Ouet, the Olieu or something like that. We had, Montmartre, Vouvray, plain.
Love those Vouvray.
She loved it not too dry, so she liked Rieslings, she liked Vouvray. But my dad, started tasting Cabernets and Zinfandels, but we liked Pinot too back then. But mainly it was probably Cabernet-based taste and then a lot of white wine. But I loved Italian wine. As I started getting more, older, I started drinking Italian wine. And when I was in college, actually, it was kind of the birth of the Washington and Oregon wine industry. So I would come down here in the late 70s and taste wine. There wasn't that much interest. We'd be tasting wines from the mid 70s in Oregon. There were a few good producers, which I couldn't afford probably even at that time. So I wound up buying Tualatin Vineyards Rosé of Pinot Noir. It really wasn't made as a rosé, but sometimes the vintages were so cold and rainy that it wound up being a rosé. And they tried selling it as Pinot at first, and they realized that's not going to fly with a public that likes these big Cabernets and big flavors and colors from Zin. So they better market it as rosé. That'll be more successful, and it was a good wine, but they weren't that expensive. We're talking about maybe less than $2 a bottle or around that. At that time, that was considered about right for a good wine. I mean, you have to remember, my family did buy a lot of Beau Tour as well from Beaulieu Vineyards with a big strip label on the back saying 100% varietal, which you think, well, why would they, big deal. Back then, the laws permitted you to have only 50% of a varietal in the bottle. So Beaulieu Vineyards said it's 100% varietal, which was a big deal. But that was $3.50 a bottle. And,
back in those days.
So, and I think, if you wanted their George Latour Private Reserve, which was considered at that time one of the best wines in Napa, it was probably like $7.50.
I know, crazy.
Well, and even when I started selling wine professionally, there was a demand for Riesling still in the public. Riesling was the most expensive and most popular varietal. German Riesling, Auslesen or something. They were more expensive than white Burgundy, people. So
what was happening there? But that's an interesting thing to go over into Oregon too, because there was a lot of Riesling planted up here, and in fact, at one point, it was about a quarter of what was planted here in Oregon was Riesling. But I don't think the consumers were there yet. They didn't know about Burgundy. Burgundy is a very it's a very out of body experience kind of wine when you get a great Burgundy. And what was the first what were some of those moments that got you really into Burgundy?
Well, when I started becoming a professional sommelier, I was starting to sell all sorts of wines in a restaurant in Seattle. I was able to taste Burgundy because, first of all, the Burgundies, Washington at that time was a monopoly state. So we had Chateau de Bligny, negociant made wines, which is kind of an inside joke if Dominique's hearing this because he now owns that place, but he does custom crush there. He doesn't try to make it bottled under Chateau de Bligny. But Bligny, there was this big commercial negociant business, and they made really kind of not very good quality wines that had the right names, whether it was Puy Fuissé or it could be Pouligny. So the wines I had that were available in the state of Washington that we could afford were, $7, $6 bottles of wine, maybe lower, $5 or $4 bottles of Burgundy that came from this chateau that the state invested heavily in buying and promoting. And they were not typical of anything except it probably had a high percentage of vinegar, as a result of flawed barrel regimen and that kind of thing. Yeah. But when I was selling wine, the first restaurant I was selling at had wines that were available if you had money and if you ordered them specially. So we had a really good selection of Domaine du Jacques. The owner of the restaurant had been a sommelier and he loved Domaine du Jacques. And Domaine du Jacques wasn't very old at that time. Yeah. So we had a deep cellar of Domaine du Jacques. We had DRCs. We also had things like Sanford and Benedict, the great 1977 through 79 vintage of Sanford and Benedict Pinot Noir from the Sonoma Coast, which is now part of the Sonoma Coast. I mean, that's
Santa Barbara.
Santa Rita. It's now known as Santa Rita.
It's funny you say that, but remember, what road is it based on? Santa Rosa Avenue. Yeah, so don't worry about that.
I'm sorry, old man brain, but or just a mistake. Anyway, yeah.
Richard Sanford, we love you.
Yeah, they were from the Central Coast, from an area that no one knew, and he was a pioneer in that area. But they were fantastic, and so I got introduced to more California wine. I got introduced to a lot of things, but when you start tasting Domaine du Jacques and you start tasting Roumier and you taste Domaine de Comte Lafon, I already knew Comte Lafon. Actually, it was one of the first Burgundies I had, not red but white, and I would go look for the bottles of Meursault, Claude Labarre, or just plain Meursault from Domaine du Jacques, and retail locations. Couldn't get them in Washington, but when I came to California, where I went every year for summer, and my wife's family is in Southern California, we'd drive through California, I'd see a liquor barn, and I'd go to liquor barns because I could find at liquor barn at that time, it was like for a couple of years, Domaine de Comte Lafon Meursault for $8 a bottle.
Oh my God.
It was like the 78 and 79 vintages, and they were wonderful. And even as a student, it was a splurge, but I would buy up to like 12 bottles if I could find them at these, and I'd even buy the reds, but the Meursaults were fantastic. So this was in the late 70s, early 80s I was doing this already. So
amazing.
But once you start tasting those, you go like, wow, this is so different, this is so unique. It's not like California Chardonnay, it's not like California Pinot, it's not like any Pinot anywhere in the world. And there weren't that many places outside of Burgundy really that was growing Pinot. Although California did have some Hansel. I tried Hansel. There was Sanford and Benedict. There were others that were pretty good. Chalon was around. I had Chalon. They're all they were great at that time. In fact, I remember what really kind of got me into Burgundy was trying to find a bottle of this great Chalon estate wine from the Pinnacles in a local Safeway, because they had a wine shop. It was like Washington had just opened up and relinquished its monopoly laws in the early 70s, and in 1972 I went to a Safeway and I saw they had Chalon, which I'd read about from Nate Croman's book on the Treasury of California Wines.
I read that book.
And I go, wow, they have Chalon, and it was expensive. I think it was like almost $10. Maybe it was a little less because I don't think I could have afforded 10 at that time. And I bought a bottle, and it was like, wow, this is amazing. And so when I had an opportunity to try Burgundy, I thought, well, this is kind of the model that Graff talks about, and they referenced me. I should try one. And when I found out about Lafon Meursault, it was sort of the end of the story.
We were tasting through these wines a little bit before we got ready to come to you guys. But You know, you talk a lot about mineral. Mineral is a great word to talk about because mineral is the earth. We're talking about, like, it's not just the grapes and how they hang here. It's the rootstock and how they go down there. Or some cases here in Oregon, they were on their own roots. But you know, what kind of made you? I mean, obviously you were successful at Quintessa and working for the Coppola and everything there in California. But what brought you here to Oregon?
Well,
with the intent of making world-class Chardonnay and Pinot Noir.
Well, I mean, I always thought that Oregon had the best location because you know, if you go to Washington, it's too hot in the grape growing areas and it's too wet on the west side. So there's no really in-between place that really is ideal for growing Pinot Noir and Chardonnay in the way that you'd find in Burgundy. You can find the locations where Riesling grows. Riesling's a little more adaptable, and there's some really great Riesling in Washington here, in the hills there. But when you get to Oregon, you have this kind of ideal location, like I think especially the Eola-Amity Hills, which is, it wasn't just Oregon I was drawn to, it was the Eola-Amity Hills. Over the years of seeing the first wineries in Oregon, the first vineyards, fruit from the first vineyards being made into wine, I knew that this was probably the best place. Why? This hill, I'm looking at the camera here, but I see across beyond it, I see the valley floor on the east side, and across that valley floor are the Cascades. The Cascades are about 35 miles away, 40 miles, 35 anyway. And I go, and if I look across there, there's this big flat plain, and I have so much sunlight. In summer, we're facing due east. I have sunrise here starting 4:30 or so in the morning, and I have sunset finally 9:45. And there's no fog, and it's cool because there's a wind coming from the west across here. To me, this is like the ideal place. It's cooler than Beaune over a 100-year period. It's cooler than Burgundy over a 100-year period. Now, you know, with global warming, things are changing, but actually Burgundy has gotten hotter than we have, even though we've had some, for us, relatively warm years and some drier years than usual, more frequently at least. But it's still all over the world you're seeing this. So, but the nice thing is we're at the 45th parallel. And the 45th parallel, if you look at Hugh Johnson's Encyclopedia of Wines, or any book, 45th parallel north or south of the equator is about the ideal zone for growing grapes. Why? You're not at the, you know, what area in the world has the most sunlight in the middle of summer? It's the North Pole. Okay? So, but that's, the season there would be very short and very brutal and probably never warm enough. Hopefully never warm enough. And you get to the equator and you have the 12 hours of sunlight, summer, winter, spring, or fall. It never changes. So in between that, the 45th parallel, you have optimal sunlight, you have long days, but you have a long enough growing season and in the right climate, because the climate around the world at the 45th parallel as it changes quite dramatically. It's very different 60 miles east of here. It's much hotter in summer, but here we have the right combination of temperature, sunlight, and the sunlight coming here, even though we have, you know, many hours of sunlight a day, it's gentle. It's really not that easy to get a sunburn here. I mean, I used to, as a kid, playing tennis with no sunscreen, playing tennis 10, 12 hours a day because, you know, that's one of the sports I could really excel at for my size. But you'd have to work hard at it. It's not the same. And when you have moisture in the morning here, the leaves of the vines don't burn because the sun is so strong. It acts like magnifying lenses. And we rarely see that kind of effect here. But in California, you see it frequently.
So right where we're at, Eola-Amity Hills is kind of we're looking pretty much towards Salem right now, and these cars going by, these are a lot of trucks and just they're agriculture people that live out here. Behind us is the hillside of the Eola-Amity Hills, the actual hills itself. So how high is it behind us right here? Besides all this great wine, of course, but there's actually the mountain, and where your estate is up here.
Well, our vineyard is planted fairly low on here because the wind is so strong. I find in this area, like around the altitude between 250 and 500 feet is ideal, because otherwise the wind is too strong. And there are vigor problems. When you go above 550 feet here, vineyards often have to be replanted more frequently because there is a problem with vigor, and it's stressful wind is stressful too, so they're more prone to virus. Where we are, you have earlier ripening a little bit. It's a little bit warmer down here, but you still get the breezes, and so it's not too cold and not too windy. But you get a nice breeze. You get the air conditioning without the wind, the strong wind. Usually, you can get the strong wind too, but usually not. So you get a long, uninterrupted growing season, because wind will interrupt the growing cycle as well as heat will. And so we have uninterrupted growth. We have these long, elegant tannins that result from the long days and the moderately warm days with plenty of sunlight. So, but the top of the hill where I live is 1,000 feet. So we're halfway up the hill where we plant, but I live at 1,000 feet, and that's the top of this hill, which isn't the absolute top altitude. I think in the Eola-Amity Hills, I think it goes up another 100 feet somewhere, or 150 feet. Then you have the valley floor that goes precipitously below that. On the other side of the hill, it's underneath. On the other side of the hill, you have the marine sediments known as Willamette sediments, sort of scraped off the ocean floor and pushed up, by the process of the geological action of the plates moving past each other, the continent moving over the ocean.
Yeah, we could get super nerdy on you guys, but we're going to talk about these great wines. Obviously Dominique Lafont, an amazing guy, very, very well known in Burgundy, great friend of yours, and really you guys kind of came together back in the 2015, 2016. Tell everyone about how you started this brand and how things were happening here and what you guys were working on kind of before. And Dominique's so I want to say one thing too about Oregon. Oregon, especially with the Pinot Noir and Chardonnays, they got some start from Domaine Drouhin coming here. And Domaine Drouhin is an amazing Burgundy house. And they came here, they saw something in their eyes. They saw that this was going to be a very interesting area. Same thing down in Anderson Valley when Roederer came there. This amazing champagne house goes to where? To this area where they saw a vision. Domaine Drouhin was here. We already had great producers, but they were super young. David Adelsheim, Sokol Blauser, all these great little producers. The Ponzis were here. They were establishing who they were. They were trying to find out what was going to work and where it would work. It was just the making of the appellation itself that was the big appellation first. That was 1983 for the Willamette Valley. And then these smaller sections started becoming defined. And that's where you started to get a little bit more interest from the French. And they started to come over here. They obviously lured him up here too. But tell us a little bit about your relationship with Thomas and also with Dominique, and how you put together this vineyard, and you purchased this property going back to the about 10 years ago. But you also put together a team. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, this area, as I said, I followed the Eola-Amity Hills. Actually, one of the first people here in the Eola-Amity Hills, the very first vineyard was what's called Elton Vineyard. It's not far from here.
It's actually just back there.
But shortly thereafter, in 77, that was planted in 75. In 77 or thereabouts, Boulanger came next door. So that became part of Argyle.
That's right.
And also around the same time that Boulanger was here, Laurent Perrier bought a place that's now Britain Vineyard. And a friend of mine owned it, and he was making sparkling wine after Laurent Perrier decided it wasn't going to make a lot of money, at least in the next 20 years. So they sold it, and a friend of mine bought it. And he was making Merriweather. What?
Is that Robert Britton?
Yeah, Robert Britton is making
great guy.
wine.
He used to make wine down in Napa Valley, you guys.
Yeah.
Very good winemaker.
So the Eola-Amity Hills really, but many French people were involved in this. Why? Because they saw the climatic and the zonal, the latitudinal similarities that made it possible really to grow these cooler climate grapes, mainly Chardonnay and Pinot Noir. But the thing about this hill is when the real revelation to me about the Eola-Amity Hills and why I recommended for evening land to be at Seven Springs, and was that Seven Springs Vineyard was planted in 1982, and the first crop was in 1985, and from that crop, 4 different wineries made a single vineyard estate wines because they were so good on the first fruit. And one of them was Adelsheim, and when I was buying wine professionally in Seattle, I got a bottle of that. And I thought, wow, this is the best wine I've had from Oregon. So I called David Adelsheim up and I said, David, congratulations. This is a new vineyard for, I never heard of it. He said, well, and then he said, well, it's not my vineyard. I just bought fruit. But he said it was so good that I had to make a wine out of it from its first vintage. It was the first harvest there. I never thought it would have this kind of fruit. And I go, wow, that's a first crop? And he said, usually that gets thrown away or, put into some rosé or something, for many vineyards. And he goes, no, it's really good. I'm going to keep buying from it. And then I found out later that other wineries did the same thing, and I was able to have fruit, wines from them. I think Bethel Heights made one. In fact, that's right. When we started here with when I left Evening Land and Thomas Sauve came and joined me with Dominique after Dominique came on board. We had a case or so he had a case or so of this wine from the hut in the vineyard, which was not air conditioned, and it was the 85 Bethel Heights 7 Springs bottling, and it was still great. I mean, there's some bottle variability because it hadn't been stored well, but it was still amazing. Even the bottles that were good were great, and the bottles that weren't so good were still, because of storage, were still good. So when I started eating that, I brought Dominique here. Dominique loved what he was doing and loved so much that he thought, wow, we have to plant more Chardonnay in the vineyard because it's doing so well for Chardonnay. And the wines that we started making there together were amazing. And when I left, he stayed because he had a team that he felt he's very loyal to the people who work with him, and he didn't want to abandon them when I left, although there was some dissatisfaction around that time. But when I planted this vineyard, he came over and said, what are you going to do? Who's going to make wine? And I go well, I'm just going to sell fruit. I don't have your expertise, and selling wine is a big chore, and you can't make and sell it at the same time, and I'll sell fruit. So he said, you really know how great this vineyard's going to be. You have to have someone. Then he came back a year later and said, Larry, did you find someone? I said, I'm not looking. And he says, then I said, unless, half jokingly and half seriously, if you're interested, then I would think about it. And he said, I am. Wow. And then we formed I already had planted the thing and it was all there, and he joined. And then Thomas, who was working with him as an assistant, not the winemaker at Evening Land, but as the assistant. Right. He wanted to leave with Dominique, and so I had a team. I just did what I thought was a good job planting it. I chose a good site, and the team kind of came because they were attracted to it. And also, I knew Dominique, and he knew it would be a great place. But you have to have a good team. Once I knew I had that kind of a team, it made sense to make wine, to build this winery, and invest in this. And I think the results have been really astonishingly amazing from the very beginning. Even when we didn't have fruit, when we were buying fruit, Dominique, actually, the reason we bought fruit from all over the first vintage in 15, we bought it from Chehalem, from Ribbon Ridge, from McMinnville, from Dundee. The reason we bought so much different fruit was Dominique said to me, Larry, every project I've been involved in Oregon has been with your vineyards that you've chosen ahead of my being involved in the company, and I want to know if you were right or if there's something better out there than what you think. And I said, let's do it. So we made wines from all over the first vintage, and he said we made some pretty good wines. And he said at the end of the process of the harvest and making wine, he said to me, Larry, I think you're going to have to buy some of this fruit for another 10 years because it could take that long for your vineyard to come into its own, and show terroir. And I go well, Dominique, I'm too old to have started a project like that. I said, if this doesn't show good wine, if this doesn't show us great wine almost immediately, which I saw from the beginning of the planting of 7 Springs and all the other vineyards that have come in the meantime, I go then I've made a mistake. And so he said, well, we'll see. So we were still going to continue to buy fruit. And then after the second harvest, he said, Larry, you can stop buying other people's fruit. Because we did it all by blind tasting. And the top wines for that harvest already were ours. All of ours were on top except for Mimi's. And Mimi's was right there. And by this time, she'd become our farmer, too.